Spring came gentle that year, as if it pitied the land for the long months of frost that had gripped it. Green pushed shyly through the thawed earth, streams ran quick and clear again, and the cottonwoods trembled with newborn leaves that caught the wind like whispered secrets. David Watson rose with the dawn, as he always did, his movements steady, practiced, unhurried. He fed the mule, stacked wood by the door, and stirred the coals until the kettle sang. He carried himself like a man who had learned to listen to silence until it became his only companion. The world knew him once as a gunslinger, but now he was only a widower in a weathered cabin, moving through days that all felt the same. His beard carried more silver than black, his shoulders stooped under the weight of years that were heavy with grief. Once, David Watson had been faster than the eye could follow. His name spoken in saloons and whispered in alleys like a warning. But fame does not warm a bed, and legend does not comfort a child dying of fever. He had buried both wife and boy, and when the earth closed over them, he had closed the lid on his revolver, swearing never again to draw it. He had lived ever since like a shadow stretched across the prairie, present, but only half alive. In the drawer beside his bed lay a tarnished locket, holding the faint scent of lavender, the last trace of his wife's hair. Sometimes, when the fire burned low, he would open it. Never for long. Pain seeped out like smoke when he did, too sharp to linger in. He had grown used to living as though part of him had already crossed into the grave. He ate, he worked, he breathed. But nothing stirred in him but the ache of memory. That morning the air smelled of rain though the sky was clear, and the earth was soft beneath his boots. He slung a rifle across his back, meaning only to check traps along the creek, to keep his hands busy. Mud clung to his boots, birds trilled from branches slick with dew, and the sun broke gently over the horizon. He had walked these paths 100 times without surprise, but that day the wind carried a sound that did not belong. Not the chatter of sparrows, not the rustle of willow leaves. A thin, broken whimper, human and faint. David stilled, his body remembering instincts he had sworn to bury. He moved with care, each step quiet, the years of killing guiding him though his soul recoiled from it. The brush thinned, and by the edge of the water he saw them. A woman, collapsed in the mud, her dress torn and stained, blood spreading dark across her side. Her face was pale, lips cracked, breath shallow. At her side crouched 2 children. A girl of 7, eyes wide but burning with a sharp light, and a boy younger still, no more than 4, his cheeks streaked with tears. They clung to her as though the earth itself would take her from them if they let go. David did not move at first. Pain rushed up like a tide, memory crashing over him. He saw his wife's hand limp upon a quilt, his boy's small body shuddering with fever. He forced it back, gripping the moment before him like a rope. These were not the ones he had lost. These were flesh and blood, trembling, clinging to life. He crouched low, his voice gravel from disuse, telling the girl he meant no harm. She stared at him, fierce though her hands shook, as if she might shield her mother with nothing but her small frame. The boy buried his face in her skirts. The woman stirred, eyelids fluttering. She whispered words that nearly broke against her tongue, that he would find them, that they could not stay here. Then her voice trailed into silence again. He asked no questions. He slid his arms beneath her, lifting her as gently as if she were made of reeds. She weighed almost nothing, her body light from hunger and blood loss. The children clung to his coat without hesitation. Step after step, he bore them across the fields, his heart pounding with each breath she drew. By the time the cabin rose before him, smoke curling from its chimney, he knew he had crossed an invisible line. Something had awakened in him again. Something he had thought buried beneath his wife's grave. Inside, he laid her on his bed and covered her with his blanket. The girl held her brother close, her dark eyes fixed on David, watching him with suspicion and desperate hope. He fetched water and herbs, cloth and needle, his hands moving steady. Those hands, once meant only for drawing steel and taking lives, now washed blood from torn flesh, bound wounds, pressed a cool rag to a fevered brow. His voice was low, steady, as he told the children to eat, offering them bread, broth, whatever he had. Hunger outweighed fear, and soon their hands shook only from the speed with which they lifted food to their mouths. The girl spoke at last. Her name was Rachel. Her brother was Samuel. Their mother, she said, was Margaret. Each word was given with care, as if she weighed whether the man before her was worthy of such truths. David nodded, offering no questions beyond what she gave. In her small voice was a burden of knowledge too heavy for her years. She had seen cruelty, that much was clear. Samuel only whispered once, his voice trembling, calling for his mama to wake. Then he pressed himself against Rachel's side and slept. The hours stretched long. The woman stirred near dusk, eyes half open, glazed with pain. She searched his face as if trying to decide if he was foe or friend. He hushed her softly, telling her to rest. Something in his tone calmed her, and she drifted again. But not before her lips shaped a name. John. The word hung in the cabin like smoke that would not clear. David sat long after, the firelight shadowing the lines of his face. John. He did not know the man, but he knew the sound of a name heavy with threat. His fingers touched the scar along his ribs, earned long ago by another man whose name carried the same poison. He told himself it was not his fight. He had walked away from such battles. But when his gaze fell on the sleeping children, their cheeks soft against each other in the firelight, something within him shifted. He had once sworn to protect his own. That oath had been broken by death. Yet here was another chance, unasked for, undeniable. The night deepened. Margaret tossed in fever, her body racked with tremors. She muttered words that twisted his gut, pleas for mercy, whispers of pursuit, cries that he would never let her go. David laid a cloth against her brow, steadied her hand in his. The weight of her fear pressed upon him like stone, yet still he did not open the chest beneath his bed. The revolver lay sleeping there, locked away. His hand hovered, but he resisted. He had not drawn it in years, and part of him prayed he never would again. Near midnight the storm quieted outside, leaving only the hush of rain dripping from the eaves. Margaret's eyes opened wide, fever bright. With sudden strength she caught his wrist, pulling him close. Her voice, raw and trembling, cut through the silence. My cruel fiancé wants to kill me. Please save me and my children. Her hand fell away, her breath ragged, her body sinking back into the mattress as though spent by the effort. David sat unmoving, her words echoing inside him. They had struck the core of the man he had buried, the gunslinger who had sworn never again. The fire popped in the grate, the children shifted in their sleep, and in that moment the cabin seemed to hold its breath. Slowly, as if fate itself had guided his hand, he reached for the key that hung upon a nail by the door. He turned it in the lock of the chest. The click was soft, but in the silence of that room, it sounded like thunder rolling across the plains. The cabin smelled of herbs and wood smoke, a fragile peace that fought against the heavy scent of blood. David sat beside the bed where Margaret lay, her breath uneven, her skin pale except where fever painted her cheeks. He had pressed a damp cloth to her brow a dozen times that day, and still her body burned like a forge. The children, Rachel and Samuel, never strayed far from her side. Their small faces mirrored each tremor of their mother's body, their fear wrapped tight in silence. David felt it pressing on him, heavier than the roof beams overhead. He had never thought of himself as gentle. Yet his hands moved carefully, binding wounds, lifting the cup to her lips, smoothing blankets that slid from her shoulders. The same fingers that had once curled quick around a pistol now lingered as though the touch itself might hold her to this world. Rachel watched with solemn eyes, studying each movement as if searching for proof that this man of smoke and shadow would not harm them. Samuel clung to her hand, his thumb pressed to his mouth, too tired even to cry. David felt their trust settling upon him like a cloak he had not asked for but could not shrug away. By morning, Margaret's fever eased slightly. Her eyelids lifted, though heavy as stones, and her gaze fell upon him. There was confusion there at first, then recognition, then something like relief. She tried to form words, but her voice caught. He poured water, held it to her lips. She drank, weak but eager, as if the coolness itself tethered her back to life. When she could speak, her voice was no louder than a breeze through grass. You saved us. The words were fractured, but they rooted deep in him. He only nodded, unwilling to speak of heroism, unwilling to accept it. He told her she was safe here. She closed her eyes as if she wanted to believe him, though doubt trembled across her face like a shadow. Later, when the children dozed near the fire, Margaret whispered again, "John." She said the name like one says a curse, or the memory of a nightmare that has followed into daylight. Her fiancé, she murmured. Cruel. Controlling. He wanted her for her father's land, her dowry, her obedience. She had refused obedience, and he had shown his teeth. She had endured blows, endured shame. But when he raised his hand to Rachel, that had been enough. She fled into the night, children in tow, carrying nothing but what her hands could hold. John had sworn she would not escape. He would rather kill her than see her free. Her words fell heavy, filling the cabin with a weight that firelight could not soften. David listened, the lines of his face unmoving though something shifted behind his eyes. He had known men like John. He had buried some. He had once been the kind of man other men sent for when no law would serve. That part of him had slept long, but he felt it stirring now, restless. The next days carried a rhythm of care. Margaret grew stronger, though slowly, and her children began to move about the cabin as though testing whether it might hold them. Rachel sat near David while he carved wood into shapes, birds, horses, simple things. She said little, but her eyes never left his hands, as if each curl of shavings carried a secret she wanted to learn. Samuel followed him outside, watching with wide eyes as David chopped wood, stacked it, repaired the fence. The boy laughed once, startled by the sound of the axe splitting a log clean in two. David turned at the sound, and though he did not smile, his chest felt warm for the first time in years. Margaret's voice grew steadier. She thanked him often, though he shook his head. He told her thanks was wasted on him, but she spoke it anyway. She said kindness must be spoken, or it would vanish like smoke. Sometimes he caught her watching him when she thought his eyes elsewhere. Not with the look of a woman searching for rescue, but with the quiet study of one who tries to understand why a man lives as he does. He turned away when her gaze grew too steady. He was not ready for the questions her eyes asked. One afternoon, Dr. Whitmore arrived, summoned by Rachel's walk into town. The old man's beard was white as snowmelt, his spectacles sliding down his nose. He examined Margaret, prodding gently, nodding at the healing wound. He told David she would live if fever did not return. His eyes, however, carried worry. He leaned close to David before leaving. "Crow's been asking questions in town," he said. "Asking about a woman with 2 children. Men like him don't stop easy." David only nodded, jaw tight, saying nothing. The doctor's eyes lingered on him, seeing what others might not, the old shadow rising. He left with a sigh. In town, whispers began to stir. Martha Lyle, the shopkeeper, brought flour and salt to the cabin one morning, pretending it was charity though David had coin enough. She pressed Margaret's hand with gentleness, and in her eyes was both pity and admiration. She told David that Crow's men had been drinking in the saloon, boasting they'd drag her back by her hair if need be. Margaret flinched at the words, her hand trembling in Martha's grasp. David's face betrayed nothing, but when he split wood that evening, each swing of the axe landed with a force that shook the ground. Night fell often with Margaret speaking in low tones, telling him pieces of her past she had once hidden. She spoke of the girl she had been before John, a girl who laughed in sunlight and believed the world held room for softness. She spoke of her children's births, how Rachel had clutched her finger, how Samuel had cried like a storm. She confessed she had thought herself weak, but fleeing had taught her that weakness and endurance were not the same. David listened, silent, the firelight deepening the shadows on his face. In her voice he heard both wounds and courage, a blend that drew him closer despite himself. The children grew bolder in the days that followed. Rachel asked David if he would teach her to whittle. He placed the knife in her hand, steadying her small fingers, showing her how to draw the blade away from her body, slow and sure. Samuel clambered onto David's shoulders when he led the mule to water, his laughter echoing against the hills. Margaret watched from the porch, her hand pressed to her chest, eyes glistening. David felt something dangerous stirring in him, something gentler than rage, something fiercer than grief. It frightened him more than gunfire ever had. But the world beyond the cabin did not rest. One evening a rider passed near, leaving tracks too fresh to be chance. David found them in the morning, his jaw tightening. The message was clear: someone searched. That night, as Margaret lay beside the fire, she whispered again that he would never stop. John would come. He had sworn it. She looked at David, eyes wide, desperate, not just for herself but for her children. "Save us, please." He met her gaze, and though he said nothing, the steel in his eyes was answer enough. Still, when he lay on his cot that night, staring at the rafters, doubt gnawed him. He had promised himself never again. Never again to take up the gun. Never again to let death claim him as its instrument. But when he closed his eyes, he saw the boy Samuel's small hands clinging to his shirt, Rachel's solemn stare, Margaret's whispered plea. He rose before dawn, paced the cabin, restless. The revolver lay heavy in its chest, waiting. He did not open it, but he felt its weight as surely as if it were already in his hand. Toward the end of the week, Margaret rose to her feet, frail but standing. She stepped outside, breathing in the spring air, her children circling her with joy. She lifted her face to the sunlight as though she had forgotten its warmth. David stood at a distance, watching her. She turned to him, her eyes brighter than he had yet seen, and she whispered her thanks again. For saving her. For saving them. He shook his head. But inside him something shifted. For the first time in years, he felt the fragile stir of belonging. That night the wind carried the sound of hooves again. Not faint, not distant. Closer. David rose, stepping to the door, his hand reaching for the rifle by instinct. Outside, the darkness was alive with echoes. Margaret woke, eyes wide, clutching her children close. David stood tall in the doorway, the fire casting his shadow long across the cabin floor. He did not speak. The sound of horses circled and then faded into silence. But the warning had been given. John's reach had stretched farther than David wished to believe. When he closed the door, Margaret's eyes met his, filled with fear but also with trust. She whispered his name then, as though tasting it for the first time, David. It broke something in him, hearing his name not as a gunslinger's curse but as a prayer. He looked down at her, then at the children trembling in their blankets. Slowly, with hands that did not shake, he crossed the room. He reached for the key by the nail, the one that fit the lock on the chest. He held it in his palm for a long moment. Margaret's eyes followed him, knowing what it meant, knowing it would bind him to her fight. He slid the key into the lock. The sound was soft, but it split the night like lightning over the plains. The days stretched like taut wire, each one humming with a tension that silence could not soothe. Spring spread across the land, softening the edges of winter, yet within the cabin the air felt weighted, as though every gust of wind carried the sound of approaching hooves. David rose early, moving with the same calm routine, splitting logs, mending fences, tending the mule, but now every task was sharpened by vigilance. He scanned the horizon when he fetched water. He paused to listen when birds scattered from the trees. Even in rest, his ears caught every creak, his hands never strayed far from the rifle leaning against the doorframe. Margaret healed slowly. The wound in her side knit itself together with the stubbornness of one who refuses to surrender, though pain lingered in her every breath. She began to move about the cabin, her steps cautious but steady, her children hovering near like shadows afraid to be torn away again. David watched her with the quiet attention of a man who remembered loss too vividly to take life for granted. Sometimes their eyes met across the room, and for a moment the firelight carried something unspoken between them. Gratitude, fear, and a tremor of hope neither dared name. Rachel clung to her mother but drifted often to David's side, where wood shavings curled on the floor. He showed her how to guide the blade with patience, how to see the bird within the block before the knife released it. She never smiled fully, but her concentration shone like sunlight breaking through clouds. Samuel followed David everywhere, his small boots pattering close behind, his laughter bubbling when the mule snorted or when David hoisted him onto broad shoulders. Margaret would watch, her face softening, as though seeing in David a figure both alien and necessary, someone who could carry a weight she had borne too long. Yet beneath these fragile blossoms of peace, shadows lengthened. News drifted from town through Martha Lyle, who arrived one afternoon with a basket of bread still warm from her oven. She spoke in low tones as Margaret poured her tea, but David heard every word. Crow was restless. His men filled the saloon, their boots heavy, their laughter cruel. They asked questions, described Margaret in words too sharp to mistake. Martha's eyes flicked toward David, a question hanging there. He offered no answer but the tightening of his jaw, the way his hand curled against the table as if restraining itself. That night, when Margaret sat near the fire, David heard her whisper the truth again. He will not stop. He will find us. Her voice cracked as she gathered her children close. David looked at her steadily, his silence heavy with promise. He had once sworn never to draw steel again. But vows forged in grief bend beneath the weight of the living. The warning came sharper a week later. At dawn, David stepped outside to find a message nailed to his barn door. The paper was crude, scrawled in a heavy hand. She belongs to me. Hand her over, or burn with her. David held it in his calloused fingers until the words blurred with the rising sun. He tore it free, fed it to the fire before Margaret could see, but the heat in his eyes betrayed the truth. Margaret noticed. Her hand trembled as she touched his arm, and though she said nothing, the question in her gaze was clear. Will you stand between us and the man who hunts us? David did not speak. He only rested his hand over hers, the weight of his touch steady as stone. The days that followed thickened with unease. David scouted the woods at dusk, circling his land like a wolf guarding its den. Tracks appeared in the mud that were not his. Branches broken where none should be. Once he found the remains of a fire still warm, hidden near the ridge. He returned home with his rifle in hand, his face carved with silence. Margaret read the truth in his expression. Rachel clung tighter to her mother, and Samuel cried himself to sleep against David's chest, as if the old gunslinger's heartbeat was the only shield that could keep night at bay. Amid fear, tenderness wove its threads. Margaret often joined David at the porch, wrapped in a shawl, her children asleep inside. The two sat in silence, broken only by the creak of wood and the sigh of wind. She spoke sometimes of her father, of the land she had lost when he died, of the way John had charmed and then revealed himself cruel. Her voice trembled less when David listened, as though his stillness itself granted her the strength to unburden. He spoke little of his own past, only fragments, a boy lost to fever, a wife buried too soon. Yet even his silence carried confession. Margaret came to understand that his pain was not absence but presence, shaping every choice he made. One evening, as twilight deepened and the meadow glowed with fireflies, Margaret said softly that she feared what would happen if John came. David turned his gaze upon her, his eyes dark as storm water. Then he spoke words that were not loud but heavy enough to anchor her trembling. If he comes, he won't leave. It was not boast but truth, spoken with the weight of a man who had seen too much death to gild it with pride. Margaret's lips parted, a tear catching the lantern light, not of fear but of something else, relief, perhaps, or the dawning belief that she was no longer alone in her fight. Rachel, watching from the doorway, saw the way her mother's shoulders eased at his words. She carried the image to bed that night, whispering to Samuel that they were safe. Samuel asked if David would be their papa now. Rachel hushed him, but her silence carried the wish he had voiced aloud. The threat grew nearer with each passing day. One afternoon, David rode into town for supplies. The saloon's hush fell when he entered, boots heavy on the boards, eyes turning toward him. John sat at a table with his men, smile thin as a knife. Their gazes locked across the room, past men who held their breath. John raised his glass in mock greeting. David said nothing, only gathered what he needed and left. Behind him laughter erupted, cruel and echoing. But the saloon doors swung shut on a silence that clung to every witness. They knew a storm had shifted in the air. When David returned, Margaret read the shadow in his face. She asked nothing, only reached for his hand as he set down the sack of flour. He let her hold it, his calloused fingers still, the warmth of her touch seeping into places long frozen. For a fleeting moment, they were simply two souls leaning against the same wind. That night, sleep did not come easily. David sat by the fire, revolver laid across his knees, watching the flames gnaw at wood. Margaret stirred, rising weakly, her hair loose across her shoulders. She came to him, sat near, her hands folded in her lap. For a long time neither spoke. Then she whispered that she feared not dying, but leaving her children to him as orphans. David turned to her then, his voice low but unwavering. "I won't let that happen." She looked at him with eyes that shone, seeing not just a gunslinger but a man who had already lost too much to let death claim more. She touched his hand briefly, the gesture small but carrying the weight of a vow. The following morning dawned still, but the silence was unnatural. Birds kept to the trees, and the air seemed to hold its breath. David stepped outside, his rifle in hand, scanning the meadow. A figure moved near the ridge, then another. Shapes against the horizon, watching. He counted 3, then 4. John's men, testing distance, measuring patience. They did not come close, not yet. They only stood long enough to be seen, then faded back into the trees. A message written in silence. David returned inside, his jaw hard as granite. Margaret asked what he had seen. He only said, "Soon." That night, the children pressed close against their mother, trembling in their sleep. David sat awake by the door, revolver gleaming in the lamplight. His eyes never closed. The storm had not yet broken, but its shadow stretched across their threshold. He could feel it pressing, waiting, promising violence. The fire cracked softly, casting long shadows that reached toward him. And in the silence, he whispered words not meant for the children's ears. "If you come for them, you'll answer to me." Morning came gray and heavy. David stepped outside to fetch wood and found a new mark carved into the barn door. Not words this time, but a crude drawing of a coffin, etched deep into the wood with the tip of a knife. He stared at it, unmoving, then ran his fingers across the grooves. Behind him, the cabin door creaked. Margaret stood there, shawl wrapped tight, her face pale but unflinching. Their eyes met across the yard, and in that quiet exchange the truth settled between them like iron. The fight had already begun. The morning broke heavy with clouds, low and swollen, a ceiling of gray that pressed upon the land as though the sky itself carried the weight of what was to come. The meadow lay still, no birdsong, no rustle of deer in the brush. David Watson stepped from the cabin with his rifle across his shoulder, the revolver holstered at his side, his eyes sweeping the horizon with the patience of a hunter. He had not slept, though Margaret had begged him to close his eyes, if only for a moment. Sleep was a luxury for men who had no enemies. He had enemies now. Margaret watched from the doorway, her shawl clutched tight around her shoulders. The children pressed against her legs, their eyes wide, their mouths silent. They understood enough to know the world had sharpened around them. David turned toward them briefly, his face carved of stone, yet his gaze lingered long enough to soften. He told them to keep the fire strong, to bar the door, to let no sound escape. His voice was calm, but calmness itself felt like thunder in that silence. He saddled his horse with measured hands, the leather creaking, the bit clinking as though each sound marked the rhythm of a drumbeat drawing closer to war. Margaret's voice came then, low but urgent, calling his name. He turned, and for the first time he saw no fear in her eyes, only plea. She asked him not to go alone. She said she could not lose him too, not now, not when her children had found safety in his shadow. He stood still, the reins coiled in his hand, her words sinking like nails into the boards of his chest. At last he answered, his tone quiet but final. "This ends tonight." Her tears rose but did not fall. She only nodded, as if some part of her had always known this moment would come. David mounted, his figure tall against the darkening sky, and rode down the path that led to town. The wind pushed against him, carrying the smell of rain and dust, the promise of storm. Each hoofbeat struck like a hammer against the earth, steady, unbroken. His mind carried no thought of glory, no thirst for revenge. Only a single vow, that Margaret and her children would not be dragged into darkness by a man who mistook cruelty for strength. The town appeared in the distance, its rooftops hunched low, its streets empty but for shadows moving behind curtains. The news had spread. Folks knew John Crow and his men had gathered there. They knew the widower gunslinger was riding in with silence at his side. No one dared stand in the street, but many eyes watched, breaths held, as David Watson's horse slowed to a walk and carried him into the heart of the town. The saloon doors swung open before he reached them. John stepped out, his smile stretched thin, his black coat snapping in the wind. Behind him fanned a half-dozen men, pistols heavy at their hips, grins sharp with cruelty. They filled the street like wolves waiting for the first drop of blood. John raised his voice, loud enough for every window to hear, mocking. "Look here, the ghost himself rides in. Thought you'd die out there in your cabin, Watson. Thought the world forgot you. But here you are, hiding behind a woman and her brats." The words did not stir David. He sat tall in the saddle, gaze steady, silence thicker than any shout. When at last he spoke, it was low, carrying the weight of a hammer striking iron. "You laid hands on her. That's enough." The crowd of hidden faces drew sharper breaths. John laughed, though it rang false. He called him a relic, said the gun on his hip was nothing but rust. He promised to take Margaret back by nightfall, promised her children would learn to kneel before him. His men chuckled, spitting in the dirt, shifting fingers near their pistols. David dismounted then, boots heavy on the street, reins dropped loose. He stood square, no boast, no flourish, only a man who had been born into violence and tried long years to escape it, now called back by the cruelty of another. John sneered, but his eyes flickered. He had heard stories of David Watson, as all men had. The widower who drew faster than lightning, who had buried men without blinking. He told himself the man was broken, rusted by grief. But as he looked into those eyes, dark and steady as the storm, he knew the truth. This was not a ghost. This was death made flesh, walking calm as a man fetching water. The standoff stretched, silence thick as tar. Then a pistol twitched in one man's hand, a spark too small to hold back the flood. David moved. Gunfire split the street, loud as thunder. In the blink of an eye, two of John's men fell, one clutching his chest, the other his throat. David's revolver cracked again, each shot precise, merciless. Dust jumped where bullets struck, boards splintered, glass shattered. The air filled with smoke, acrid and choking, the echoes rolling down every alley. John's men scrambled, but none matched his speed. Another dropped, then another, the street painted with silence broken only by the ringing in every ear. Within heartbeats, only John remained, crouched behind a trough, his smile gone, his curses wild. He shouted that Watson would die here, that no man could take everything from him and live. But his voice shook, his bravado crumbling. David stepped forward through the smoke, his revolver steady in his hand. He did not run, did not rage. He walked as if each step was carved into the earth by fate itself. John fired, bullets whistling past, striking dust, breaking boards. None found David. He raised his own pistol, leveled it, and spoke once more. "You should have left her be." The shot cracked like the world breaking open. John jerked, stumbled, and fell, his hand clawing at the dirt as though he might hold on to the life spilling from him. His eyes found David in those final moments, wide not with hatred but with fear, the fear of a man who had mistaken cruelty for power, only to learn the difference too late. Then he was still. Silence settled heavy on the town. Smoke drifted, horses stamped nervously, windows creaked as faces disappeared into shadow. David stood unmoving, revolver lowered, chest rising slow with breath. He turned then, leaving the bodies where they lay, and mounted his horse. No cheer followed him, no hand reached to pat his shoulder. Men like him carried no laurels. They carried only the weight of what they had done. The ride back to the cabin was slow. Rain began to fall, soft at first, then heavier, washing blood from his coat, soaking the earth. He welcomed it, let it cleanse what it could. By the time he reached the clearing, Margaret stood waiting, shawl drawn close, children pressed to her side. Her eyes searched him wildly, then softened when she saw he lived. She ran to him, tears mingling with rain, her hands trembling as they gripped his arms. "You came back," she whispered, as if she had feared he never would. He said nothing, only held her, the children crowding around his legs, Samuel's small arms clutching his waist, Rachel burying her face against his coat. That night the cabin glowed with firelight. David sat by the hearth, his revolver returned to its chest, locked once more. Margaret moved quietly beside him, stirring the pot, her children curled on a quilt at her feet. For the first time in years, David felt not the emptiness of silence but the fullness of it, the silence of peace, of belonging. Margaret met his gaze across the fire, her eyes bright with gratitude, with something deeper still, unspoken but alive. His heart stirred, not with the violence he had carried that day, but with the fragile warmth of being needed, of being seen. When at last the children slept, Margaret drew near. She touched his hand, her fingers soft against his scarred knuckles. She whispered that he had not only saved them but given them back their lives. David shook his head, his voice rough as gravel. "No. You gave me mine." The fire burned low. Outside, rain fell steady, washing the land clean. Inside, the family he had not sought but had found leaned close, their shadows mingling on the wall. David Watson, widower, gunslinger, ghost of the past, sat not alone but with hearts that beat beside his.